They told us Cleopatra conquered with her beauty. But that's a lie, and one Rome wanted us to believe. Because if history could reduce her to a temptress, then every empire that fell before her could claim it was undone by lust, not by a woman's brilliance. In truth, Cleopatra's weapon was never her face. It was her ability to manipulate perception itself. To her enemies, she appeared as a seductress; to her allies, a divine queen; to her lovers, the answer to their deepest ambitions. This wasn't vanity, it was strategy. Plutarch, writing in his Life of Antony, admitted that her power came less from physical beauty than from what he called her irresistible charm, a force woven into her voice, her presence, her timing. She understood what modern psychology calls framing, the ability to dictate not reality itself, but how reality is seen. The Romans feared that power more than they feared her armies. Octavian, Caesar's heir and her eventual destroyer, understood that no legion could be sent across the Mediterranean without a justification that ordinary Romans could swallow. So he fed them an image, Cleopatra, the foreign temptress, a barbarian queen who had ensnared Antony and would soon poison the Republic. His propaganda painted her as a sorceress of the East, dripping in gold and perfumes, corrupting the discipline of Rome. The truth, that she was one of the most educated rulers of her age, fluent in multiple languages, skilled in economics, astronomy, and politics, was buried beneath Octavian's campaign. Psychologists call this tactic reframing through demonization. If you cannot defeat someone on their strengths, redefine them by their weaknesses. By branding Cleopatra as a seductress, Octavian stripped her of political legitimacy in the Roman imagination. She became not a rival queen, but a dangerous distraction, an embodiment of Rome's anxieties about foreign influence and female authority. Yet even this distortion reveals her genius. Cleopatra herself leaned into the image when it served her. She knew that perception was pliable, and she mastered the art of turning stereotype into theater. Her beauty became a costume, her allure a stage. Every gesture, every entrance, every whisper was calculated. Like a skilled hypnotist, she knew people would see not her, but what they most desired or feared to see. Here lies the unsettling truth. Cleopatra's legacy shows us that seduction is not about attraction. It is about power over the mind's lens. What Octavian dismissed as mere feminine wiles was, in reality, a psychological strategy, one so effective that Rome's greatest men bent under its weight. And so, from the beginning, Cleopatra forces us to question the stories history tells. Was she a temptress, or was she a tactician who bent the world by controlling how it looked at her? But Cleopatra's power wasn't in her beauty. It was in how she made men believe she could rewrite their destiny. The first impression can enslave the mind. Psychologists call it the primacy effect. The brain clings to what it first encounters, shaping every judgment that follows. Cleopatra understood this centuries before psychology gave it a name. For her, the first meeting was not an introduction. It was conquest. When Julius Caesar entered Alexandria in 48 BCE, he stepped into a city bleeding from civil war. Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII both claimed the throne. She knew her survival depended not on armies, but on a single audience with the most powerful Roman alive. Yet how could she reach him? The palace was guarded, and Ptolemy's advisors wanted her dead. She did not arrive like a supplicant. She arrived as theater. Ancient sources tell the story with variations, but the essence remains the same. Cleopatra smuggled herself into Caesar's presence rolled inside a carpet or a sack, only to emerge dramatically before him. Cassius Dio records the astonishment at her sudden appearance, the sense that this was no accident but a stage play designed to seize Caesar's attention. Vulnerability became audacity. a supposed act of desperation transformed into a display of daring. Imagine the moment, the hush of the chamber, the torchlight catching dust in the air, Caesar turning to see a bundle unfurled, and then, out of it, the young queen rising, dressed with care, her voice steady, her eyes unflinching. She had entered as contraband but rose as royalty. That inversion alone carried a psychological shock. In that instant, she was no longer the exiled sister. She was the queen who defied walls, guards, and fate itself. Here, seduction was not about softness but spectacle. Cleopatra weaponized surprise, the same mechanism modern psychologists identify in pattern disruption. When expectations are shattered, the brain becomes pliable, searching for new anchors. Caesar, the conqueror of Gaul, the general who had stared down thousands, was confronted with something he could not predict. And unpredictability, when wielded with elegance, is power. Plutarch suggests her charm lay in the blend, her voice, her presence, her confidence. But it was the staging that magnified it. Cleopatra didn't simply meet Caesar, she directed the scene. She understood that leaders are not swayed by facts alone, but by the drama that wraps around them. Just as Roman generals staged triumphs with incense and parades, she staged herself. This was her genius. She turned weakness into theater. Smuggling herself into the palace could have been seen as humiliation, a queen reduced to a fugitive. Instead, it was transformed into a mythic gesture, retold for centuries. She knew that if her first act made Caesar see her as more than a claimant, as something extraordinary, then every word she spoke afterward would echo with that aura. And it worked. Caesar, nearly 30 years her senior, did not dismiss her. He installed her back on the throne beside her brother, ensuring her survival and giving her the leverage to rule. The girl rolled in a carpet became, in a single performance, the equal of Rome's greatest man. This is why Cleopatra unsettles us still. She proved that power often belongs not to the strongest, but to the one who controls the story of the first meeting. To command perception at the outset is to command the future. And from that moment, Cleopatra proved that seduction wasn't about flesh, it was about theater. To Rome, Cleopatra was easy to dismiss. Another monarch caught in Caesar's orbit, a beautiful diversion in his relentless march toward power. But to Alexandria, she was no man's ornament. She was Pharaoh reborn, and she made sure Caesar knew it. The Romans called her mistress. She called herself divine. Cleopatra understood the danger of being reduced to a lover. Rome had a long history of exploiting foreign queens and then discarding them. She would not be another captive paraded in triumph. Instead, she positioned herself not as Caesar's concubine, but as his partner in rule. Their bond was staged in public, wrapped in ritual and myth. The message was unmistakable. This was not the story of a Roman conqueror and a submissive queen. This was the union of two powers, one wielding the sword, the other wielding the gods. Psychologists call this association bias. Link yourself to a higher symbol, and the mind elevates you beyond ordinary judgment. Cleopatra cloaked herself in the image of Isis, the goddess of rebirth and protection. Coins minted during her reign show her adorned with divine attributes, her profile unmistakably paired with symbols of Isis. To her people, this was more than politics, it was prophecy fulfilled. By binding herself to the goddess, Cleopatra became more than a woman. She became the vessel of eternal Egypt. Caesar, too, was drawn into this theater. For a man who had styled himself as a descendant of Venus, Cleopatra's divine persona was irresistible. Together, they presented not just a romance but a fusion of myths, Rome's Venus and Egypt's Isis, uniting heaven and earth. Behind the pageantry, however, was raw calculation. Cleopatra gave Caesar legitimacy in Egypt, while Caesar gave Cleopatra the Roman legions she needed to crush her brother's faction and reclaim the throne. Each gained power by appearing to elevate the other, but beneath the glitter of alliance was tension. Was Cleopatra shaping Caesar, or was Caesar using her as a pawn in his broader ambitions? The Romans believed she was ensnared by him. The Egyptians believed she was elevating him to divine status. The truth lies in the uneasy balance between both. In this contrast, we see Cleopatra's brilliance. She never allowed herself to be confined to one role. She was simultaneously lover and queen, concubine and strategist, mortal and goddess. By inhabiting all masks at once, she denied her enemies the ability to define her. Here is the paradox that unsettles us. Power often disguises itself in intimacy. To Rome, it looked like surrender. To Cleopatra, it was sovereignty cloaked in affection. She blurred the lines so thoroughly that even Caesar, the most calculating man of his age, became part of her narrative, not the other way around. And once she had secured Caesar, she learned the most dangerous lesson of all: intimacy could be turned into empire. Seduction was never Cleopatra's endgame. It was the opening move. Where others saw romance, she saw contracts written in flesh and desire, bargains sealed not in ink but in intimacy. Cleopatra blurred the line between personal and political until every liaison became a treaty. Her relationship with Caesar illustrates the point. To Roman gossip, she was his mistress. To Egyptian eyes, she was a sovereign who secured the most powerful ally on earth. Their union was not whispered in shadow but flaunted in spectacle. When Cleopatra bore Caesar a son, Caesarion, she cemented more than a lineage. She crafted a political weapon. A living child tied Rome to Egypt, Caesar to Pharaoh, and gave her claim a permanence no Senate decree could dissolve. Historians note that Caesar never publicly denied the boy. In a city where succession was everything, this silence spoke volumes. Cleopatra understood the psychological principle of social proof. Legitimacy comes not from declarations, but from what is allowed to stand unchallenged. Caesarion's very existence whispered a dangerous possibility: that Egypt might merge with Rome not by conquest, but by bloodline. But seduction was not only about heirs. It was about resources. With Caesar's backing, Cleopatra restored Egypt's shaky finances, secured trade routes, and crushed her domestic rivals. She knew what Machiavelli would later write: alliances born of love alone are fragile, but alliances born of mutual need can withstand the storms of betrayal. Cleopatra embodied this centuries before the words were written, and yet her genius was not confined to Caesar. After his assassination in 44 BCE, she moved with chilling precision. While Rome convulsed in chaos, Cleopatra waited, watching the factions tear at each other. Then she set her sights on Mark Antony. Their first meeting in Tarsus was another masterpiece of statecraft disguised as seduction. Draped as Aphrodite on a golden barge, she lured Antony into her orbit not as a man, but as Rome itself incarnate. What looked like feasting and flirtation was a negotiation staged with wine and incense, a contract written in the language of desire. To Antony, she offered wealth, ships, and legitimacy in the East. To Cleopatra, he offered protection, legions, and the chance to elevate her son Caesarion as a potential heir in Rome's dynastic wars. Each indulgence was a transaction, each kiss a policy. They built not just a romance, but a political bloc strong enough to shake Octavian's hold on power. Here the psychological dynamic is unmistakable. Cleopatra weaponized what modern scholars call intermittent reinforcement, mixing affection with grandeur, vulnerability with dominance. She kept her partners uncertain, always craving the next gesture, the next promise, the next vision of glory. This uncertainty bred dependence, and dependence is the leash of power. But there is menace in this strategy. Every bond she forged carried within it the seed of destruction. Caesar's favor made her queen, but his death in the Senate left her exposed. Antony's devotion raised her empire, but it also painted her as Rome's ultimate threat. Cleopatra understood that seduction could secure power, but it could never guarantee safety. This is the paradox that lingers like a shadow across her reign. Every victory won through intimacy also sharpened the blade poised at her throat. But Caesar's death would prove that every seduction carried its own death sentence. Power rarely announces itself in silence. Sometimes it arrives with drums, silk, and the scent of perfume heavy on the air. Cleopatra knew this truth better than any general. When she sailed to meet Mark Antony at Tarsus in 41 BCE, she was not attending a negotiation. She was staging a coronation of perception. Plutarch, centuries later, described the spectacle with awe. Antony, hardened by years of war, a man who had stood shoulder to shoulder with Julius Caesar, was undone before a single word was spoken. Cleopatra approached not as a queen pleading for Rome's favor, but as a goddess descending to earth. Her barge, gilded and immense, glided up the Cydnus River. The sails were purple, a color reserved for royalty. Oars dipped in unison, silver flashing in the sun. She reclined beneath a canopy of gold, dressed as Aphrodite, the goddess of love, while attendants fanned her with peacock feathers. Flute players and children disguised as cupids lined the vessel. It was not an arrival. It was theater, performed with such precision that Antony, the seasoned soldier, became its audience. What unfolded that day was more than display. It was psychology in motion. Modern scholars would call it anchoring. By staging herself as divine, Cleopatra reset the scale of comparison. From the first glance, Antony was not negotiating with a mortal ruler, but with a goddess incarnate. How could terms of silver or wheat be bargained with when the opponent's image was celestial? Antony was trapped before he even stepped aboard. The Romans, steeped in their own mythology, understood symbols as deeply as swords. Antony, claiming descent from Hercules, was suddenly faced with Aphrodite herself. The symbolism was irresistible. Hercules and Aphrodite, strength and love, destiny woven together. Cleopatra ensured that the moment of first contact was not political but mythical. In doing so, she disarmed Antony's pragmatism and replaced it with desire cloaked in destiny. Psychologists point to priming. When the brain is immersed in a powerful sensory experience, subsequent choices bend toward the meaning of that experience. Cleopatra overwhelmed Antony's senses with music, fragrance, and spectacle, priming him to interpret everything she said and did as part of a larger, inevitable union. He was not making a choice. He was stepping into a script she had already written. The awe was deliberate, but so was the dread. For Rome, luxury was both fascination and fear. Romans believed excess softened discipline, corrupted virtue. Antony, veteran of brutal campaigns, was now drawn into Cleopatra's world of feasts and festivals, of wine-drenched nights in Alexandria where he followed her rhythms rather than Rome's. His peers in the Senate whispered that he had been enslaved by an Eastern queen, corrupted not by swords but by silks. And this was precisely Cleopatra's design, to make Rome itself see Antony not as a master of Egypt, but as its supplicant. Her gambit worked. Antony granted her political concessions, restored her lost territories, and eventually fathered children with her, further binding Rome's fortunes to Egypt. Every indulgence he accepted became another strand in the web she wove, until he could no longer tell where pleasure ended and obligation began. Yet beneath the gilded pageantry lay a colder calculation. Cleopatra was not gambling her survival on Antony's affection alone. She was binding him publicly, so that every Roman who opposed her would also see him as compromised. By turning Antony into her devotee, she turned his power into her shield. In private, she gave him intimacy. In public, she gave him theater. Together, they created a spectacle so potent that Octavian, watching from Rome, understood he was not only fighting Antony, he was fighting the myth Cleopatra had crafted around him. This is the sinister brilliance of Cleopatra's gambit. Antony thought he was choosing her, but she had already chosen the stage upon which his fate would be written. He was not her partner. He was her performance, the centerpiece of a drama meant for all of Rome to witness. By turning Antony into her captive, Cleopatra turned Rome itself into her stage. Power can intoxicate, but seduction can enslave. For Mark Antony, what began as fascination with Cleopatra's grandeur became a hunger he could no longer resist. Rome had forged him into a soldier of discipline, yet Egypt unraveled him with feasts, perfumes, and a queen who seemed to hold both pleasure and destiny in her hands. Plutarch describes Antony in Alexandria not as a conqueror, but as a man bewitched, following Cleopatra into rituals, masquerades, and nights of indulgence. Together they formed what was called the inimitable livers, a circle of endless revelry. Wine flowed, dice rolled, banquets stretched until dawn. But beneath the laughter was something darker. Antony was surrendering not to joy, but to dependence. Modern psychology calls this intermittent reinforcement, the most powerful form of conditioning. Cleopatra knew how to alternate intimacy with distance, extravagance with restraint. One day, Antony would drown in her affection. The next, she withheld, drawing him further into pursuit. This cycle burrows into the human mind like an addiction, making the subject desperate for the unpredictable reward. Antony, who had commanded legions, now found his will bound to a queen who controlled not only his pleasures but his sense of purpose. The consequences were devastating. He abandoned duties in Rome, ignoring Senate debates and pressing campaigns. Instead, he lingered in Alexandria, a Roman general reshaped into Cleopatra's companion. To the outside world, it looked like weakness, but within the psychology of control, it was precision. By making herself the center of Antony's approval, Cleopatra ensured that his choices aligned with her survival. The apex of this control came with the donations of Alexandria in 34 BCE. Before a grand audience, Antony and Cleopatra presented themselves as rulers of a new world order. Cleopatra, dressed as Isis, was declared Queen of Kings. Caesarion, her son with Julius Caesar, was named co-ruler of Egypt and Cyprus. Antony, ostensibly Rome's champion, stood as the herald of her divine authority. It was not simply politics. It was theater designed to show that his identity was now inseparable from hers, but control disguised as devotion is always sinister. Rome saw Antony's transformation as corruption, a general softened, a man emasculated by an Eastern queen. Octavian seized the moment, flooding the Republic with propaganda. Antony was no longer Roman, he was Cleopatra's slave. And yet, the brilliance of Cleopatra's strategy lay in its truth. Antony was enslaved, not by chains of iron, but by the invisible chains of dependency. Psychologists speak of learned helplessness, when repeated reinforcement convinces a person that resistance is futile. Antony reached that point. To return to Rome meant humiliation. To resist Cleopatra meant losing both love and identity. He chose instead to remain within the gilded cage she had built, a willing captive. Each banquet, each embrace deepened the bars around him. Here lies the menace of Cleopatra's power. She understood that desire could be sharpened into control. Antony was not conquered in battle. He was conquered at the dinner table in the quiet whispers of the night, in the moments when he realized he could not breathe without her approval. Seduction had evolved into dominion. But what Cleopatra offered Antony was never free. It always came with chains. Rome prided itself on discipline, the steel of its legions, the austerity of its fathers, the unbending virtue of its senate. Masculinity was not merely an ideal, it was the republic's backbone. Against this rigid self-image, Cleopatra was cast as the antithesis, softness, indulgence, and corruption embodied in a single foreign queen. Octavian knew exactly how to exploit this contrast. As Antony's rival for power, he understood that defeating him militarily was only half the battle. The real war was for Rome's imagination. So he recast the conflict. It was not Antony versus Octavian, but Rome versus Cleopatra. In speeches and pamphlets, he painted her as the true enemy, the fatal woman who had seduced Antony, drained him of Roman discipline, and threatened to enslave the Republic itself. This was propaganda at its sharpest, and it struck where Roman anxieties already festered. To the Roman elite, Eastern luxury was a source of suspicion. Gold-draped banquets, jeweled thrones, intoxicating perfumes, these were symbols of weakness, reminders of how empires decay. By associating Antony with Cleopatra's opulence, Octavian branded him as un-Roman, a man conquered not by armies but by appetite. The psychology here is clear. Octavian weaponized moral panic. By projecting Rome's fears of decadence onto Cleopatra, he created an external scapegoat for internal instability. Antony's failings were no longer his own. They were the result of her poison. The Senate, the soldiers, the citizens, all were told the same story. Rome was in danger of falling, not to legions, but to a woman's charms. And it worked. Coins were minted with Cleopatra's image alongside Antony's, reinforcing the idea that he had surrendered his identity to her. Poets and orators spread the image of Antony as her thrall, a general turned puppet. The battlefield had not yet been chosen, but in the minds of Romans, Antony was already defeated. What is most sinister is how effective the narrative became. Even now, centuries later, Cleopatra is remembered in popular culture more as a seductress than as a strategist. Octavian's propaganda lingers, shaping our imagination of her. The foreign temptress was never just a Roman insult. It was a political weapon that outlived her, embedding itself in history. But Cleopatra herself played a part in this theater. She leaned into the image of divine queen, embracing luxury and spectacle as her instruments of power. What for Egypt was legitimacy, the queen as Isis, for Rome was corruption, proof of their darkest suspicions. In making herself a goddess, she became a monster in Roman eyes. This is the paradox she could not escape. The very performance that enthroned her in Alexandria damned her in Rome. Octavian exploited the dissonance until it became a drumbeat of paranoia, carrying Rome to war. And in exposing Rome's deepest fear, Cleopatra sealed her own fate. The Battle of Actium in 31 BCE was not just a clash of fleets. It was the moment seduction itself tipped from weapon to weakness. For years, Cleopatra's influence over Antony had elevated her throne and secured her empire. But influence is a blade with two edges, and at Actium it cut too deep. Antony, once the embodiment of Roman resilience, arrived on the battlefield not as Caesar's hardened general but as Cleopatra's consort. His fleet carried not only soldiers and sailors but the heavy weight of perception. Rome believed he fought as her champion, not his own. Octavian exploited this mercilessly. His propaganda made the sea battle more than a contest for power. It was a referendum on Antony's soul. Would Rome bow to discipline or to a queen's indulgence? The fighting raged in the Ionian Sea, ships crashing, oars splintering, smoke curling from burning decks. Cleopatra commanded a squadron in the rear, her flagship marked by purple sails. For the Egyptians, her presence was legitimacy. For Antony, it was temptation and tether. When the tide of battle turned, Cleopatra made her fateful move. Her fleet suddenly broke formation and retreated toward open waters. Ancient sources differ on why. Some claim it was strategy, others panic. But what matters is Antony's response. The man who had marched legions across deserts, who had bled through decades of war, abandoned the field. He turned his flagship from the fight and followed Cleopatra's retreat. His soldiers, left leaderless, collapsed into chaos. Octavian's fleet seized the moment, and victory became slaughter. To Rome, this was confirmation of every suspicion. Cleopatra had unmanned Antony, reduced him to a follower rather than a commander. Plutarch and Dio both record the disbelief. Antony, the warrior, undone not by steel but by the pull of a queen's ship. What Octavian had claimed in words was now carved into history by action. Antony had chosen Cleopatra over Rome. The psychology here is devastating. Cleopatra's influence had crossed into what modern theorists might call overdependency. What once made Antony formidable, his devotion, his willingness to bind his fate to hers, became a liability when devotion demanded abandonment of duty. Love had transformed into surrender, and surrender into ruin. For Cleopatra, too, the unraveling was tragic. The very performance that had bound Antony to her now destroyed the legitimacy of their cause. What once looked like divine union appeared to Rome as corruption, betrayal, and weakness. Her greatest strength became the weapon Octavian used to crush her. And yet, Cleopatra was not finished. Actium was disaster, but she understood something Antony did not. Survival sometimes requires one last, desperate performance. But even in defeat, Cleopatra had one last, sinister card to play. Conquerors dream of parading their enemies in chains. Octavian wanted Cleopatra alive, displayed in Rome as proof of his victory. But Cleopatra refused to be anyone's trophy. If she could no longer command destiny through seduction in life, she would wield it in death. Plutarch tells us the accounts differ. Some claimed she smuggled a basket of figs into her chamber, hiding within it the venomous asp. Others whispered of ointments or hidden poisons. What remains constant in every version is the same truth. Her death was deliberate, theatrical, and calculated to deny Octavian his prize. She would not be dragged in chains through the forum. She would leave on her own terms. The imagery mattered. Ancient Egyptians believed the asp, sacred to the goddess Isis, symbolized divine rebirth and protection. By choosing that death, Cleopatra turned her suicide into ritual. It was not despair but performance, a queen aligning her body with eternity. To her people, she became more than a fallen monarch. She became Isis incarnate, ascending beyond Rome's grasp. Psychologists call this reactance, the human drive to assert freedom when control is threatened. Stripped of armies, allies, and wealth, Cleopatra still found one realm where Octavian could not command her, the moment of her own death. By choosing it, she regained agency and transformed defeat into final victory. For Octavian, it was a humiliation veiled as triumph. He entered her chamber to find the queen already gone, her attendants Eras and Charmian dead beside her. Charmian, adjusting Cleopatra's crown even in her last breath, declared, "It is well done and fitting for the descendant of so many kings." Octavian could claim Egypt, but he could not claim her living body. Cleopatra had robbed him of the theater he craved most, her humiliation in Rome. Her suicide also rewrote the narrative. No longer simply the temptress who lured Antony to ruin, she became the queen who defied the conqueror in her final act. Seduction had begun with carpets and feasts, but it ended with the silence of a queen lying in regal dignity, choosing venom over chains. The lesson was unmistakable. Even stripped of power, Cleopatra could still manipulate how history would remember her. This haunting control unsettles us still. She weaponized allure not to cling to life, but to shape death itself. By doing so, she denied Octavian the satisfaction of mastery. She reminded the world that true power is not merely domination of the body, but domination of the story. And in death, Cleopatra became eternal, both goddess and warning. History has often forced Cleopatra into a narrow role, the temptress who ruined great men. But this caricature is itself proof of her genius, and of the fear she inspired. Octavian, the man who built his empire upon her downfall, exaggerated her as a seductress precisely to erase her political brilliance. To reduce her to beauty was to deny her strategy. To call her a temptress was to mask the unsettling truth. Cleopatra had mastered the psychology of power in ways Rome could not admit. She showed that seduction was never about passion alone. It was about performance, framing, and the ability to bend perception until reality itself shifted. Each entrance, each gesture, each carefully chosen word was a weapon. Where generals deployed legions, Cleopatra deployed desire. Where emperors relied on swords, she relied on symbols. She made intimacy into diplomacy, spectacle into strategy. Modern scholars have begun to peel back Octavian's propaganda, revealing a woman who spoke multiple languages, studied philosophy, governed complex economies, and wielded ritual with surgical precision. She was no passive enchantress. She was an operator who understood that power is not just taken, it is performed, believed, and obeyed. And her methods did not vanish with her death. They endure in subtler modern forms. Today, rulers do not sail golden barges, but they stage televised rallies. They do not declare themselves divine, but they wrap themselves in symbols, slogans, and myths. Seduction has been repackaged as propaganda, as marketing, as political theater. Psychologists call it narrative framing. Control the story, and you control the choices people believe they are freely making. Even intimacy itself has been weaponized. Where Cleopatra blurred the line between lover and ally, modern power brokers blur the line between personal desire and political loyalty. Leaders, corporations, and influencers alike exploit the same psychological levers she pulled centuries ago: reward and withdrawal, spectacle and silence, awe and dependency. We like to imagine that we are wiser, immune to such games. But history whispers otherwise. The tools remain the same, only the costumes have changed. This is why Cleopatra unsettles us still. She forces us to confront the fragility of reason when faced with performance. She proves that conquest does not always wear armor or ride a horse. Sometimes it wears a crown, a smile, or a whispered promise. Her life was a reminder that power often flows not from the battlefield, but from the stage of the mind. She was not merely Caesar's lover or Antony's ruin. She was the architect of a different empire, one built on perception, intimacy, and psychological control. That is why her name has never faded, even as Rome itself crumbled to dust. Cleopatra proved that the most dangerous empire is not won by swords, but by shaping the desires of others.